right, it's time for a little hawk Tao, as it were. First time doing a video like this, but you know what? As a learning competitive player, I think this is going to be mostly helpful for me. And I don't know if anyone else thinks this is useful, then great. We were having a conversation in the Tao Discord server about what a good game plan would be to prevent getting alpha striked and sort of just blown out of the game by specifically the Outrider detachment, I think Outlander Claw of Gene Stealer Colts on this board setup, which is GW1 Mission E as an Echo, which is taken hold with one of the battle line related. I don't even remember what it was. It doesn't matter. We don't have any battle lines, so who cares, right? It's the one that lets you free heroic. So yeah, this is the deployment and everything. And someone was talking about how in their game they sort of just got scout moved at, run at, shot at, and they didn't feel like they were able to respond quick enough. And I think the biggest thing that it seemed like to me is we did not put ourselves in a good enough position to be able to stage on turn one, which is especially in a board like this. The most important thing we can do is put ourselves in the position for the big turn two that Retaliation Cadre really likes to have with the 3-inch deep strikes. You got crisis suits raining from the sky and a lot of shots ready to come your opponent's way, right? So you really want to make sure you're able to stage effectively to be able to do that. Now, before we get into sort of the specific deployment that you see, I wanted to go over just some things that immediately stick out to me if I'm sitting here going to this GT that I'm thinking about for this game. Some of this is specific to GSC, but some of this is just kind of generic game planning stuff. So the first and foremost thing is that the objectives are almost completely in the open, right? There's small spots right here where maybe you can hide a few guys, but not across, this angle either way. And that's like about it, right? Like you can hide here as well. And that's really it. The middle is completely in the open. You're generally not supposed to be able to stand right here in most terrain sets. So that's really nice for Tau because we should be able to keep our opponents off of primary for a lot of the game. Should not be giving up 15s. Should generally be trying to, I think, hold our opponents to 5s, I think, on this sort of layout, which is a really good thing for us. A really important thing to note as well, I think on this sort of deployment, I am playing this one as the natural expansion objective for a couple of reasons. One, it's very easy for us to get our opponent off of this objective because of this aforementioned angle right here. It's very difficult for your opponent to hide basically anywhere. They need some sort of lone op, whatever, but then you can, throw OC onto the point to make sure it's not an issue. Two, there's not the best staging opportunities to get people off of this southern objective right here, right? And similarly for us, the main area that people are going to be staging is the Angron pocket, as we're going to call it, right here / right here, and they're going to try to come over. But I think it's easier to try to play for that than it is alternatively if we were looking the other direction, someone coming out of here. Like it's a lot easier to play around units that may or may not come from this Angron pocket. So we're sort of playing this one as our natural expansion one, the one we want to try to play for. We're hoping our opponent, generally gravitates towards here. I think we're happy if the battle looks like this. And then, generally we're not going to be in the middle. Some other things. Hammer and Anvil is generally really, really good for Tau. Reason being, deployment zones are 24 inches apart, so it's very hard to get charged turn one. Also, it's just easy to move block on Hammer and Anvil because it's the most, I suppose, it's the thinnest deployment, right? There's just not as much horizontal room. So it's pretty easy to move block. Usually there's just fewer shooting lanes that we need to worry about, which means, more resource allocation in critical spots and easier to gum up the works and make it difficult for armies. Finally, okay, I guess that's actually the main game planning things is sort of like natural objective, the fact that the objectives are in the open, and then the hammer and anvil point. So going into GSC then, important things to understand is that they're going to be scouting and coming at us really hard with Outrider Claw. It's going to be fast. They're going to hit hard, but it's a very one-dimensional army, right? They want to come for you. And we can play around some things knowing that. One is that a lot of their long-range shooting has a range of 36 inches. From here all the way down to here can be outranged by Tau, where most of our long-range shooting is going to be 48 plus with things like broadsides and riptides. So this is winning. We can, in general, Tau should expect, from my understanding, I'm not particularly experienced in the GSC, so, take what I say with a grain of salt. I should say that in general. Take everything I say with a grain of salt. This is mostly for me to learn as much as you all. I am not the authority on this. I'm not Richard Siegler or Kyle Grundy, so follow what they say better. But I think Tau can reasonably expect to win the gun battle down the long sight line, which is really good if we're hoping to keep our opponents off of here. 36-inch range is definitely a big part of that. It sort of forces them to come out a little bit further if they want to hit you, where obviously they're exposing themselves to more sight lines. Also more liable to like rapid ingress threats in the Angron pocket that can then come around and deal with them on the following turn. Another thing is that for Outrider Claw GSC, it's really difficult for them to charge through walls. So we don't need to be too afraid staging our units because they just don't run too many dudes. You can just stand an inch back from the wall. So, it becomes pretty good for us to stage here. They're just not really going to get to you, and you don't need to be too afraid. It forces them to run around this way, which does take more movement and is generally more annoying for them. The third is that this specific list that this person was running has a Dark Strider, which is nice against all of the bullshit that GSC is going to try to pull with ambushes. They have in Outrider Claw, they have the pick up a unit and put it back down later when you want to. That stratagem, like Dark Strider, just kind of makes this a lot less scary. I think Hammer and Anvil also makes that a lot less scary in general too, because they're again, there's just less room in Hammer and Anvil a lot of the time. So that's a lot of good things. A couple worries, I suppose, is that it is difficult to stage. We sort of already went over that. It's just sort of difficult to be where you want to be on the board, specifically around these flank objectives. Things are going to die when they go out there. We are playing a trading game. And that's how it is, right? Two is that if they have indirect, Dark Strider does have to go with the Pathfinders. It's just something to keep in mind. Not the Rock Wreckers. Well, they might be able to take indirect too. I was specifically looking at the Ridge Runners. I don't think they should. I think they should have the mining lasers. I think you're pretty happy if they have the indirect, but a bunch of AP0 damage when indirect kind of sucks. However, it's enough to make it so that Dark Strider would have to go to the Pathfinders. Then the other thing is that this sort of northwestern quadrant, specifically looking at this area of the board, is actually really dead. There's not much going on here. Also here, very little cover. It's very in the open, and it's very, very far to get to this objective on both sides, which is something we sort of already discussed. But it's a concern for both sides. Definitely I think a problem to overcome is how do we meaningfully not just completely abandon a quarter of the board, because generally want to avoid that. Otherwise our flank will collapse and the game becomes very difficult. So that's sort of what I'm looking at. So I came up with sort of this idea for how I would deploy against both specifically GSC, like I said, or also any army really, with units being in either blue or yellow. Blue are going to be your non-negotiables. You're going to drop these units in these places basically every game, particularly against GSC. But I think basically every game you're dropping your units there. That can always be your first drops. Attacker, defender, doesn't fucking matter. You're putting them down. The yellow are all negotiable, where things could go one of a couple places. Maybe you start things on the board. Maybe you start things off the board. Sort of depends on what you want to do, what your opponent's trying to do, and how the deployment looks. As far as reserves and deep strike, so I should actually, let me read the list that we're theoretically playing with. This is not a list I would play with personally. I think there's a couple things that I would change. But it's 2 Star Scythe units, 1 Flamer, 1 Burst, 1 Sunforge, 1 Plasma Fire Knife, 2 Riptides, 2 unit of 2 Broadsides, a Ghost Keel, Pathfinder Squad, Crew Carnivores, 3x3 Stealth Suits, Dark Strider, and 4 Commanders, with one of them being a Farsight. I'm going to assume there's a couple Cold Stars in here. I don't know exactly what kind of Commanders they are. If I had to guess, 1 Cold Star is going with probably the Burst Cannons, either that or Farsight, and then the Cold Star goes with the Flamers. And then probably a Cold Star with the Fusions. That's pretty typical. And then the other 2 being Enforcers. Or I guess the other 1 being an Enforcer. That's my guess. I don't know if it's true. Someone can tell me. My one concern with this list, I've actually played a really similar list. I went 4-1 at the SoCal Open. What did I do? I went 2-1 at an RTT with a very similar list. I did not have the extra unit of Star Scythes. Instead, I had a Fire Knife unit. So 2 Fire Knives, 1 Star Scythe with only Flamers. And then I cut the 4th Commander and instead was running... And I also didn't have Dark Strider. I instead was running an Ethereal and a Vespid unit. And I think my concern with this list, I do worry its scoring is not great. I think not having the Vespids is really tough. Retaliation Cadre with Vespids is so good at doing secondaries. I think you can expect to score somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 points on secondary with Retaliation Cadre Vespid. This is missing that big piece. So something to think about. I don't think it really matters too much in this case because we're going to run with what we got. Okay, so let's talk about what we're starting in reserves and Deep Strike based on that list. I think every game, no matter what, you're always starting a Sunforge unit or the Sunforge unit and your Flamers. Well, I think you're always starting your Sunforges in reserve, no matter what. Or in Deep Strike, I should say. Flamers, I think, are pretty good in Deep Strike a lot of the time, especially on this map. On this terrain, GW1, Hammer and Anvil, take and hold. I don't see a place where you're very happy deploying your Flamers. Only place is maybe they could go here, and you could put your Plasma Fire Knives in Deep Strike, or you can just kind of put them both here, and you stick them in the Angron pocket, and then they come out and they torch something. I think I would like more to have them as a rapid ingress threat. You know, they can come down back here, they could come down over here. They could threaten to come in your opponent's backfield, right, and just take them off of something. Well, I guess their backfield's here because of... This deployment's so weird. Hammer and Anvil is a little... I've not seen it in a while. So I think already this game is like not something I would typically expect to play. But regardless, I would start the Flamers in Deep Strike this game. I also typically like to start 1 unit of Stealth Suits in Strat Reserve. I don't think you have to. As you can see, I have a lot of places where you can put Stealth Suits. You know, if you wanted to do you're always placing this one. If you wanted to do second one here and then the third one here, or third one there, second one there, I don't really care. I think it kind of depends on your game plan, how afraid you are of how hard they're going to come at you. Broadsides in reserve. This is a really interesting one because typically people like to leave them in reserve. They try to rapid ingress them or something, or just bring them off the table edge and hope they get good sight lines on something, moves them further up the board. I'm going to be honest. GW1, Hammer and Anvil. Guys, this is the best firing lane you're going to get. There are 2 turns of movement off of this objective as well. I think there's an argument to just fucking start them on the board. Honestly. Because, in 1 turn of movement, they can just see down this. So anything here is dead. So I would say start them on the board, but I get it if you don't want to. Just sort of something to consider. So anyway, let's talk about the non-negotiables and what everything's trying to do. So as we established, this is going to be our natural expansion objective. We want to make sure we have a unit with good OC in the area, as well as putting a lot of our firepower in a position where we can control this firing lane here. Because we want to make sure anytime our opponent tries to put something on this objective or this objective, we are able to shoot it with a lot of our army. That way we are keeping them off primary, right? Seems logical enough. So we've overloaded a lot of our, long-range firepower on this side. Pathfinders can just generally play to pop out here one way or the other. provide OC, provide guiding. They go on the go turn, right? Pretty self-explanatory. It's a really easy 10 OC that can just pack onto this point when you need it. 1 unit of stealth suits here. I think you're always putting this unit of stealth suits here, so you can do things like turn 1 containment, turn 1 cleanse. What else could you do with this unit? I don't have the secondaries up right now. This is like an Action Monkey stealth suit, and they're always, again, going to have like viable sight lines down. Let me clear some of my lines. They should always be able to see down that and that for guiding purposes. I think you always drop a unit of stealth suits here. Very non-negotiably. Every game. Okay. Kroot, very similar. I think basically every game they're going to scout up here. You're welcome to sticky your home before turn 1 command phase. I think that's a logical thing to do. I don't think that is a mandatory thing to do. If Dark Strider is going to get indirected, I think you always do it. But really, you're scouting them into the Angron pocket here, kind of lining this terrain feature, obviously outside of the terrain. That puts them in advanced range of an area denial, puts them, in reasonable charge range of anything on the point, so you can pack OC onto it to deny primary. You basically let them hang out until you need to force a response from your opponent in one way or another with a Kroot unit sitting here, right? Behind them, I'm going to put my Plasma Fire Knives. Reason being, very hard to get to this angle on turn 1. Because of the way the footprints are, you deploy them right behind the Kroot on the line. Your opponent would have to come up very far to be able to shoot them. If they really want to do that, I think you just kind of accept that. Also, just go first 5-head. I mean, honestly, I don't think there's a better place to deploy them where they're not going to be exceptionally useless a lot of the game. And the reason why I don't want to deploy them like back here behind a Riptide is because I really want them to be Angron, right? They're going to be Angron sitting in the Angron pocket. I desperately want them, and your opponent should do the same thing. On GW1, you always want something that can come out and just fucking blast something, because as you can see, they can realistically apply pressure to all 3 objectives from this point. They're a very big threat. You put your Kroot in the middle on turn, say, 1 or 2, and then once your opponent kills them, your Plasma Fire Knives jump out and they kill whatever killed them. And that's all of a sudden a massive threat. It's an 8 OC blob. There's an Enforcer Commander with them, so they're super annoying to shoot at, right? I think you always want them in the Angron pocket, and you just deploy them here and say they're either not going to get shot, or if they do, my opponent is overextending. And that's the argument you're trying to make. Riptide in the middle, pretty self-explanatory. You're planning to come out this way. It can see down the long sight line. It can see also this sight line. By turn 3, you can put your Riptide on the center objective. Good stuff. We love that. Finally, the Ghost Keel, your other non-negotiable. You always want it to be in a position where if your opponent is going to kill it, they would need to come into the kill box. As we have established, that part of the board should be your kill box. Anything that comes out here needs to die. And that's the question we're trying to pose to our opponent is, do you want to put anything on your natural expansion objective? Yes or no? And if they do, you need to kill it, and you need to be able to substantiate that threat. The Ghost Keel is going to be a huge part of it, because given its lone op range, if they need to come up here to kill you, you should be able to kill them back. I'm perfectly happy if my opponent wants to bring up their Ridge Runners, bring up their Rock Wrecker, and try to go into my Ghost Keel, where I can then Sunforge it or Broadside it on the following turn. The other nice thing is this 3 OC, that with 10 inches of movement, you can really easily put on the point. Out contest cheap stuff, right? And then if it's infantry, high OC bricks of things, again, just kill them, right? And then you ask the question too, if your opponent puts something here and you kill it and you put your Ghost Keel here, now they need to do something about the Ghost Keel. It asks them the question. I think it always goes there. That's going to be all the non-negotiables. So let's go over some of the yellow stuff first. And then we'll kind of get into the stealth suits and like all the screen blocking and everything like that. So I think you can put a Riptide either here or here. Riptides work best in pairs. You want them playing towards the middle of the board. I think this is a little conservative back here. This one does allow you to play for this firing lane, which you otherwise don't really have substantial threat on. You're also still 2 turns of movement away from this objective, which is really big. You want to be able to put on turn 3, I think your general game plan should be 2 Riptides on the center objective. You're asking your opponent, what are you going to do about it, right? Especially for GSC that wants you to hit you hard and fast. If they let 2 Riptides get onto the center objective turn 3, they're probably in a pretty difficult spot. That's one option. The problem is that a Riptide here might not really get to do much on turn 2, which can be a problem. Other option is somewhere in like this neighborhood. If you don't put the broadsides on the board, I think you definitely have the Riptide be your first substantial threat on this long firing lane. Otherwise, I think your opponent just gets turn 1 movement for like 2 free. You want the Riptide to be able to kill some bikes, for example, if they try to come up with the help of the Ghost Kill, right? You need substantial threat here if they just decide to put guys there. If you put the broadsides on the board, I think you can realistically start the Riptide basically just like, here or here behind the other Riptide, and it's the same game plan. You just have a group of 2, and you eat them up the board at your opponent on the center by turn 3. It's more one-dimensional, for better or for worse, right? It means that they're going to be working more closely together, but you do lack the threat on this firing lane. I think both are fine. The burst cannons, very similarly, you can put them over here. If they have a cold star, I think this is fine. If they don't, I think this is really bad. Because with the cold star, they should be able to get basically to the edge of your deployment zone and kill whatever is here or here, right? Like they put threat onto the objective. The problem is I don't really know where they go after that. Because again, this is sort of like a dead quadrant. And honestly, like if you just got a unit of stealth suits chilling back here, making sure you're not getting deep striked or anything, it might just be fine. Only thing you have to be careful of is, if your opponent does kill the Ghost Kill, you need something being on this flank. That is where broadsides in reserve could be really good. You bring in broadsides here on your turn 2 or so. The problem with that would be if you get pushed back by GSC bikes and your broadsides are coming back here. That'd be a huge issue. So it's a little weird. I'm honestly not sure what the answer is. Other option, again, is like the burst suits with the cold star have threat onto this objective. And this objective, they're able to play for that firing lane very nicely. It's a bit more of a balanced approach. I think it gives them a more clear job, but also, again, it devotes a lot of your forces into sort of like this pocket, which can be punishable. Finally, brings us to stealth suits. I think this is really interesting. What the stealth suits are doing this game. So, as it's already notable, there are 4 places where I believe the last 2 units of stealth suits could go. And I think it depends on how your opponent deploys, where I actually don't know if this opposing list has infiltrators. If they have infiltrators, that's very relevant. You probably always put a guy there if they have infiltrators, or like one of these first. But anyway, I kind of talked about the role of this unit already. It just provides like an action monkey over here, guiding down that way, right? I think this one here could realistically be bluish. Like I think you always want those stealth suits there, because again, I think especially if like both these aren't here, I think you're very this is very empty, and that could be a problem, especially against GSC. So I think you pretty much always want one there. Then there's a lot of things you could do, because a big thing that bike heavy fast armies with a lot of scouts are going to do is they're going to try to scout at you. And something I've learned is that it's basically always worth 60 points to stop a bunch of scout moves that are going to be game changing, because if you can keep them behind, I would say this line on turn 1, you're in a really good spot. Because as we've established, a lot of that is in the kill box, right? And then if on their turn 1, it forces them to just sort of stage, right? Stage. It allows you to then put your foot on the gas pedal going first, which is sort of the case that happened this game. With all of a sudden you start deep striking stuff, you take more board control, you move crude up, you start asking questions, right? And you have the answers to respond. Or if you're going second, you just hang out because at some point they got to come and get you, right? So, I think it makes you more okay with your opponent staging on turn one if they're not able to scout aggressively and stage much further up, or worse, just get in, push you really far back so that you're not able to access the critical angles that we've sort of talked about. So this is the most conservative drop. It does screen out scouts sort of here-ish, which is good. It prevents them from getting super far up. The main thing is it means that, if they're going to try to really come at you, their targets are probably going to be, the Ghost Keel. If they can get around and get your stealth suits, cool. That's basically it, And then if you're going first, they probably don't scout into the middle of the board, right? So it just is discouraging a big turn one play. They don't get to go quite as far as they want. This is by far the most aggressive if it looks like your opponent is just going to try to send it down this way. If they go first, then this unit in the middle dies, but they are then forced to, again, even with 12 inches of movement, if they want to come forward and actually stand on objectives, which they would need to because they are going first, at some point you got to stand on circles, they're coming into the kill box, right? The problem is if they get to scout out and then move 12, they can circumvent your kill box, and that's a huge issue. So it stops that entirely. If you go first, great. I advance them over here. I advance them over here. I stand them on a circle. I ask a question, right? Unit's probably dead, but they've done their job. They've stopped the scouts. Very similarly, I think if your opponent looks like they are really aggressively trying to stage things like here, and I should say circumvent the staging problems and just get a jump on this side of the board to take you off your natural expansion, you can put as a unit of stealth suits here. This angle is actually very difficult to shoot. Really, the only place I can see it is here, which is it's quite exposed over here, right? And then if they're back here, they're not going to see you. And very similarly, it just completely prevents them from scouting up this way, right? So it forces them to scout back, but then, if there's a unit of bikes back here, like what the hell are they doing? Similarly, like Ridge Runners, you can outrange them at 36 here, right? So they're sort of, I think you're very happy if your opponent puts their speedy units that would otherwise take you off this objective back here. They're going to get into the Angron pocket no matter what. But it also prevents them from scouting into it. So they do have to leave their stuff back here. Maybe you could take some pot shots. It does just make them slower. It makes it a lot more difficult for them to, in one turn, make this entire, close that entire gap with multiple units, which is important. Because if they're only closing the gap with, say, one unit that started right here, this unit can't make it anymore, right? Because they couldn't make it out of their DZ with scouts. The unit that's here, maybe they get close, but it's a lot more manageable of a threat. They're not able to descend upon you with a wall of dudes on their turn. So that's really what I would think about. You're not giving your opponent really any good shots. You're staging up super nicely, right? Your Riptides on turn one will be able to get themselves into prime position to be able to pop out on turn two, right? You have good staging opportunities everywhere. You just kind of shuffle your guys and you're ready to go moment's notice as soon as your opponent shows here, here, here. And that's the most important thing. You're asking difficult questions to answer, and you're basically forcing them to walk into big guns on an open board, and you're not letting them come beyond our kill box that we've built. So that's sort of how I'd approach this game from a game planning perspective. I think scoring on secondaries would be really big. Probably pretty difficult outscoring primary. I do think going first is tough here, but it does give you an advantage in that it's hammer and anvil and you get more board control. So that's nice at the very least. Um, yeah, I don't know. Tell me if this was in any way helpful. I got no idea. See ya.